it's funny, you look at yourself in these cameras on your phone, and you realize how much you look like your kids sometime. I look just like my 9-month-old right now. Today I thought I would make a car video about something that I think is really, I want to say misunderstood, but it's not. It's an opinion. So, I mean, I have a strong opinion about what we're going to talk about. And it's something that I just don't think is really discussed, right? In the, I guess you could say manifesting community. And it's very important, in my opinion, even though it's not discussed, which is exactly why I like to do car videos. And, I've talked about similar subjects on the podcast. And this subject is like, it's not going to appeal to all of you by any means. But I think if it interests you, it's very helpful. All right. So enough teasing of the subject. Basically, like, something that's been on my mind recently is that, I've been reading a little bit, at least, of some of Neville's older lectures, later lectures, I should say, from like the 60s. But, Neville in general, like, one of his main, I guess you could say, concepts or ideas, or for him, his belief, is something he talks about. Like, he has his short essay called The Search, which is from the 40s, not from the 60s. The Search. He mentions the search in 5 lessons as well. But basically in the search, and in general, Neville talks about, like, when you think of something, when you think of perfection, right? When you become Jesus, right? When you become Christ, really, right? When you rise to that level, everything matches your perfection. And Neville says, at least in several places, he says, this perfection, it's matched outwardly. So in other words, perfection cannot see imperfection. So in like some of these later lectures, I think, and maybe this isn't the search, I forget, pardon me for not remembering exactly, but in several places, Neville's like basically like, like someone who is embodying Christ consciousness, perfection, they can't see imperfection. So like if people are wounded or hurt around them, they become healed, right? If there's a dry river and water is needed, water shows up in the river. Stuff like that, basically miracles naturally occur because of the perfection that is embodied in you in Christ's consciousness when you are Christ. Again, he talks a little bit more about this in The Search. I'll link to The Search in the description if you want to read that. And this idea of like, your inward perfection will make things outwardly perfect, manifest outward perfection, is something we see a lot in New Thought teachings. It's not like Neville's the only one who discusses this. It's the idea that, like, if you are in tune with God, if you are embodying Christ, that the outward world changes, molds into that consciousness that you are. And we see a lot of this in, like, if you look at like yogic traditions and more like Eastern traditions, especially like, Indian yogic stuff, some of these ideas as well. And what I want to talk a little bit about is I don't believe that. And I think a lot of people who are into more like the mystical traditions, whether it's like Zen or non-dualism, that like, bop, shabop, bop, 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 mystical, ineffable, spiritual approach, they don't believe that. In other words, you can feel perfect inwardly and feel this deep peace And it has nothing to do with your external circumstances, or it's not necessarily going to affect your external circumstances in any way whatsoever. Or it can affect it, but not in this, entire all-encompassing way that Neville and a lot of people describe. It's not like your external world is going to match up and everything's going to become perfect when you feel perfect on the inside. So, this is obviously like a nuanced type of discussion, but I think it's worth having, and I hope I'm conveying it a little bit in this video, like this idea. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this book, but there's this very, very famous book, Autobiography of a Yogi, which is by Yogananda from, he wrote it, it's from like 1950 or so. I'd be curious, like a lot of people in the Neville community, I think especially, but in the manifesting community, it would probably be worthwhile for them to read Autobiography of a Yogi. Because in that book, Yogananda talks a lot about this idea of like what Neville talks about. Yogis, these spiritually enlightened beings, are because they're have this Christ consciousness. He actually uses that term because he was into, Yogananda does, because he's into, fusing East and West. They would have miracles. They'd be able to heal people, stuff like that. But even in that book, it's like they only can do it to a certain extent. And there's a lot of people that think that Yogananda was kind of a nutty guy and not as serious a spiritual teacher as he made himself seem. But any way you look at it, Autobiography of a Yogi is a fantastic book. And so if you're into Neville and have questions about this stuff, that's an interesting place to look. But what I'm talking about more is like Ramana Maharishi, like someone like that, like Ramana, like everyone said he was an enlightened being, right? He had like Christ consciousness or whatever. And people would go to him and he would usually just be silent. People would go to him and a lot of people would be healed, right? Because they would pick up on his energy. But it's not like everybody was healed. It's not like the world, the external world around Ramana was perfect, became perfect because he was enlightened. Or Ramakrishna. I don't know if you know like the Ramakrishnas, like the Ramakrishna was like, and I think I'm saying Ramakrishna, is that right? I haven't said this word in years. Ramakrishna was he was another Indian saint from around like 1900-ish, maybe a little bit earlier, 1800s. He was alive. Ramakrishna was like, everybody was like, this guy's enlightened, right? He's a mad saint, right? And like, people just want to be near him because, to get his energy, and like to be like, tell me something, give me the miracle or whatever. And so he put like, his hand on them, and they would like feel this energy, this jolt of energy, right? They'd feel this perfection, this enlightenment going through them. But Ramakrishna would be like, I don't have any powers, I don't have any magic. Like, this is just like the energy, right? But the world around him wasn't perfect. And all these people talking this highfalutin theory about, if you rise in Christ consciousness to this certain level, like everything becomes perfect, your world becomes this externally perfect manifestation. I think they're describing it the wrong way. It becomes externally perfect in the sense that you feel okay and at peace with everything. And that's a very different perspective and viewpoint than like your external world is going to change and become perfect. It's more like you're okay with everything. You love what is, to quote Byron Katie. Byron Katie's a fantastic example of this. Byron Katie, you could easily look at her, if you want to look at her through these very, spiritually myopic lenses of like declaring this person's enlightened and not unenlightened and all this crap, which I don't honestly believe in at all. But Byron Katie is like a modern enlightened person, right? But like the world around her is not like this perfect world where everyone's instantly healed and, everything just lines up perfectly for her. It's more that just she's at peace with whatever's happening. And a great example of this, she talks about this thoroughly, if you see her talk or whatever on videos, but a great example of this is probably my favorite book. If I had to choose one spiritual book I could keep and could read, would be her book, 1,000 Names for Joy. 1,000 Names for Joy. In that book, Byron Katie is describing her day-to-day life, basically. And it is so fucking far out there that you're like, what the fuck? Like, it's amazing. I mean, this woman is deep as it gets, and she's just this lady who lives in the United States in, the 21st century. It's very far out there. 1,000 Names for Joy. My favorite spiritual book. But the perfection she sees as she embodies Christ consciousness, or whatever you want to see it, is very normal and mundane. It's not like she's not like, oh, I'm going to externally manifest this now, or just naturally this is going to externally manifest. It's more like, no, I'm just going with the flow of what happens. And I mean, I've said this before in the podcast, like 1,000 Names for Joy, you read like 2 pages of that book, any 2 pages. Most of the theories that you hear in these manifesting circles, Byron Katie, she's not trying to do this, but she just does it because she's speaking so truthfully. She destroys all those theories, incinerates them. In any page or 2 of that book, you read that. If you're being serious about this stuff and genuine, you read what Byron Katie says and you feel it, and you're like, oh yeah, that's how it is. An even more mundane example, one of my favorite people in the spiritual world, the modern spiritual world, is Jan Fraser. You read her books like When Fear Falls Away, or what is it? Freedom of Being, I think it is. But anyway, you read Jan Fraser, and this is just like this lady's just, she's living her life, but she's like enlightened. And it's not like, oh, externally everything lines up and is like, perfect externally in terms of everything is, I go from one magical hayride to another. It's more just like I'm at peace. There's this imperturbable peace within me. Jan talks a lot about how that imperturbable peace, that peace that passeth understanding, has nothing to do with what's going on externally. And that's what I'm getting at here. That peace, when you touch that peace, and you don't have to be this enlightened person. You can touch it. You can touch it right now. That's why I always talk about being in the moment, vibing out, being present even through just movement, doing funny stuff. And you touch it, it's perfection. But it's internally based. It's not based on what's going on externally. And yes, there is this weird type of connection where your external world certainly can change. And if you feel more relaxed and at peace because of your touching this inner peace, it's almost inevitable that external changes will positively happen in your world. You'll become more relaxed. This is what I've always talked about when it comes to this manifesting stuff. This is why I'm interested in talking about it. But that peace it's not disturbed by external stuff in the way that people might expect, and it's not it's okay with what's going on right now. It doesn't mean it doesn't have preferences. These people have preferences still. Everybody has preferences, and it's perhaps easier to get your preference if you're at peace in this way. But it's not like what Neville and so many of these new thought teachers are talking about, where like you rise in consciousness and your perfection is matched in everything and externally the whole world shifts. I mean, that's a theory. I get it, like the idea of it. And it might be true. Maybe I'm wrong. But there's nothing in my experience, and there's nothing when I've spoken to Jan Fraser before, and I've taken workshops with Byron Katie before. There's nothing I've seen that makes me believe that like this imperturbable peace within us is like directly related to externally manifesting perfection outwardly. Perfection's right now, always. And that's what these great spiritual teachers are talking about. Not, oh, I'm going to manifest, da-da-da. So I hope this was helpful.